let's have a vote now. And I'll remind you of the words of the motion. The cab rank rule should remain and be adhered to, even in the context of climate change and the lawyers are responsible declaration of conscience. Would you please raise your hand if you support the motion? Okay, I'm going to count. Krista, can you count? Help me count. Okay, you count. So this is for the motion.
This is for the motion. 1, 2, 8. 19. Is it the lowest time? Yes. I mean, starting exactly.
Okay, and who is against the motion?
$15.
30-15. The Wimbledon score. Well, we'll see what happens now. So I'm going to ask Christopher to propose the motion.
Well, thank you. I want to begin by thanking Middle Temple for organising and hosting this debate. Both Mr. Powlesland and I have strong views about the discussion matter, and it's an honour and privilege to be able to debate here in such an historic and legally important setting. Historic and legally important are, of course, also terms that can be applied to the subject matter of this debate, the cab rank rule. The rule, the principle of English justice, which performs two important functions. Firstly, it seeks to ensure that the popularity of a client is not determinative of whether he or she gets represented in court, and that despite the prevailing politics of the time, a barrister cannot refuse to act for someone because of political, personal, or emotional feelings towards the client or towards what the client is said to have done. And secondly, by ensuring that we can't refuse clients for these reasons, it provides protection to the barrister, so he or she can legitimately say, I am not here to judge. My job is to represent a side without fear or favour. Although it is an imperfect rule, as a general proposition, if it is within our competence, we are ethically obliged to take the next customer that comes along, much like the London cabbie who picks up the fare simply because he's next in line. The principle has been around for centuries, and the barrister's profession, I would say, has developed around it. For example, in 1792, Thomas Paine, the author of The Rights of Man, was extremely unpopular and loathed by the establishment and much of the population. The reason for this was that he dared to object to the way our political system operated, dared to suggest and set out how democracy could be fairer and better for all. The prevailing thought at the time was that he was a troublemaker, a revolutionary, a rabble-rouser, and for this reason he was politically persecuted and dragged through the courts. My learned friend Mr. Powlesland, as a passionate voice for climate activists who dare to challenge the system and by their unpopular methods find themselves before courts of law, would no doubt have a degree of empathy for the position Thomas Paine found himself. No doubt that Thomas Paine, to find himself being prosecuted today, my learned friend would want someone capable to be first in the queue to represent him. However, in 1792, there was no queue. So unpopular was the defendant that the only man willing to represent him, Thomas Erskine, felt the need to say this in his closing speech about what is now known as the cab rank rule. I will forever, at all hazards, assert the dignity, independence and integrity of the English bar, without which impartial justice, the most valuable part of the English constitution, can have no existence. From the moment that any advocate can be permitted to say that he will or will not stand between the Crown and the subject arraigned in the court where he daily sits to practice, from that moment, the liberties of England are at an end. I know that when it comes to climate change protesters, animal rights activists, and those who commit crimes due to moral conscience, Mr. Powlesland would agree with every word I have just uttered as to their right to representation, irrespective of their unpopularity. The key difference between us is that I believe our ethical principles don't just apply to people or causes that I happen to agree with. Or to put it more accurately, I object to the suggestion that my learned friend gets to dictate to his colleagues who and what causes are allowed to be represented based on his honestly held and passionate views. The point of this rule is that he doesn't get to choose which side in a legal fight gets representation. I don't get to choose, you don't get to choose, and most importantly, neither does the government today. At the outset, I'll make two important concessions. Firstly, climate change, and what I mean by that is the impact the human race is directly having on the very survival of our species, is the single biggest political issue in the world and everyone living it. It is not a future challenge, it is a clear and present one, and nowhere enough is being done to address it. Secondly, the cab rank rule on its own does not guarantee access to justice for all. It is simply a rule that prevents clients being turned away by us due to such things as their beliefs, ethnicity, sexual orientation, what they're accused of, and what side of the argument they're making. In the capitalist system in which we operate, our code of ethics do not require barristers to work for free. If it did, if the rule said we have to work for anyone, even if there was never a fee, then only the truly rich could ever become barristers, because why would anyone pay a fee if we were obliged to work for nothing? We'd be working in the voluntary sector, and given the years of expensive qualifications and training required for a barrister to become a barrister, that would not be a sustainable model for the future. The rule, of course, does not oblige us to work for a fee either. We can work for free, or as many in this room know it, pro bono. I know my learned friend here regularly does such work, as do I. In this way, the description cab rank rule is appropriate. The cabbie is only required to pick up a customer as a fee if there's a fee to be paid, in the same way that a restaurateur is not obliged to give out free food. It can lead in some cases to an inequality of arms. Someone being sued may not have access to funds. Someone trying to take on an oil company in the civil courts might not have the finances to back up the legal action. We do need better recourses for people and better legal funding for people in the civil courts. Were my legal friend here to be one of what he says is 175 lawyers signing a declaration demanding better funding for civil cases, then of course I wouldn't have an argument with him. But that's not his declaration, because that isn't my learned friend's cause. My opponent's argument is not to secure better funding. He simply wants to stop people who he disagrees with having access to lawyers and recourse through the law. He's not seeking equality of arms. He's seeking to take away arms from those he disagrees with. There has been some people who have challenged him online, and there has, and I think he would agree with this, some attacks from him to such people as judges and the chair of the bar. For want of a better phrase, he wishes those people to be associated with the people and clients they represent, so that through pressure and social stigma, they're no longer willing to represent them. Some people away from this room might ask, well, what's wrong with that? Why shouldn't people be associated with their clients? Well, I'll tell you. Barristers as a profession follow one code of conduct, one set of rules, of which the cab rank rule is just one of them. When I started in this job, I got to choose what area of law I wanted to practice in, but I didn't get to choose my ethical code. A barrister who regularly represents Shell Oil, for example, may earn more in a week than I do in a year from legal aid, but they still have the same code of conduct as me. We're both still barristers. I've been practicing mainly in criminal law now for 16 years, and I've progressed to the more complicated and serious cases. At very worst, these cases involve allegations of murder and rape, sometimes of children, sometimes of extremely young children. Some of the evidence is very difficult. Some cases have kept me up at night, and there are images, and I'm thinking of one particular case, which are burned into my brain so much that I don't think I'll ever forget. When I meet new people, I'm often asked how I represent those who may be guilty. I think my reasoning and response is sound. I believe in a system in which people are not assumed to be guilty. And but for people like me, the very real mistakes sometimes made by the police, which have led sometimes to the wrong person being in the dock, wouldn't have been uncovered, and innocent people would be in custody. The legal system needs people like people that take a dispassionate view, defend and prosecute serious cases, and try to ensure that only the guilty are convicted. Doing so hasn't always been easy. I'm based in Leeds, and there's been a number of what we call grooming gang trials there. I've defended in a couple of. A few years ago, during one of these grooming trials, there were protests in front of Leeds Crown Court for people associated with groups such as the English Defence League. These people would often say disgusting comments, not just to the people accused of the crimes, but to their barristers going into the building. Like my learned friend here, they believed that we should be associated with our clients. Like my learned friend, they thought public derision and pressure should be brought to bear so that certain people or clients could not get representation. The essence of their argument was the same. The cab rank rule, the principle that barristers can't pick and choose their clients based on who they are or what they're said to have done, shouldn't apply in such circumstances, because some issues are just too important. In one of these grooming type trials, I recently represented an Asian man who was in the dock with many others. He was one of only 2 people found not guilty by the jury. And I'll tell you this, had he had not someone testing and probing the evidence on his behalf, the result would have been different. Sometimes the innocent do get caught up with the guilty. Sometimes the wrong person can be caught up in alleged criminality, and the system and society need people like me to represent them. That's why it's not okay to associate barristers with their clients. By representing someone, for example, accused of murdering someone, I am not to be equated with a murderer. I'm not pro the killing of people. I represent people accused of crimes because I'm a barrister. That is my job, and I am proud of it. Now, I know my learned friend may wish to try and divorce his argument from criminal law. He might want to say, well, this is simply about those who represent the fossil fuel industry. But there's 2 flaws with that argument. Firstly, to say it's okay to go up to barristers representing a polluting company and pressurise them not to attend court, but it's not okay to go up to barristers representing someone accused of swindling old age pensioners of their life savings is simply ridiculous. If it's okay for my learned friend to harass his legal brethren because he disagrees with them, it's okay for anyone on any issue that they genuinely and honestly believe to be important to do the same. Second, the Declaration of Conscience that he signed didn't just mention environmental law. It specifically brought in criminal law by targeting those who might prosecute climate protesters in the criminal cause. I say target because some of the people that signed up to that spoke to the press in the days that followed, and they're quoted as saying that they wanted to be able to say to prosecutors going into court, why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. It's not your job. You can just choose not to. I'm proud to be in a profession that has a rule that forbids me to refuse a case for someone out of fear that people might associate me with, or because protesters might pressure me, or because people who think they know better get to tell me who is worthy of representation and who isn't. And I do want to make one thing clear. I don't think that way because I am a criminal barrister. I think that way because I am a barrister. I knew the deal when I entered this profession. I knew the rules. I knew what putting on that wig and gown meant, and so did my learned friend, Mr. Powlesland. There were other practical reasons to consider. Our sister profession, solicitors, do not have this rule, and many solicitors' firms have contracted specifically to profitable groups of clients and promise not to represent opposing sides. Were barristers to fall under the same pressure, they have the defence of saying the cab bank rule. Thank you for the cases, but I will have to accept other cases in future if I'm available and I'm able to do it. There will be some barristers, of course, who break the rule. There were some doctors who breached their professional conduct. There were some police officers who breached theirs. But I would suggest the vast majority of my colleagues adhere to their basic rules, adhere to this. The suggestion of cab rank rule, the nearest thing my profession has to a Hippocratic oath, should be abolished, I would suggest, is irrational and is both morally and ethically speaking counterproductive. It would give fossil fuel companies unlimited ability to contract directly with all barristers of any talent in that area of law, scoop up all the talent with absolutely no safeguards or recourse or arguments against it. It would also put people like myself under enormous pressure by wrongly associating me with the cases I do. As I conceded at the beginning, the climate change is a genuine and real emergency. In order to combat it, laws need to be created that protect it. But my learned friend here isn't arguing for such laws. We need better legal aid funding for civil cases. But my learned friend here isn't here to argue for such funding. We need more organisations that crowdfund such cases. But again, that's not the debate. Instead, he is here to attack an important principle of justice that, were he to succeed, would undermine something in our legal system, I should say, that works, is special and we should be proud of. It's a shame he didn't pick a different fight for his cause, but he didn't. And that's why, on this issue, so many of his colleagues are against it, and why I would suggest everyone else should be too.
You're right. Mr. Powlesland, in response.
I've already set out to you in the declaration the seriousness of the climate crisis and why we need to have no more fossil fuel expansion projects. So I don't really want to go on too much more about the seriousness of that. But what I will say is, and I don't think this is disputed by Mr. Moran, that the seriousness of the climate crisis, that this is a crisis of such gravity that it forces us to step back and look beyond the immediate rules and laws that we have around us at the moment and wonder what we do in the context of history. In that sense, it is a crisis of such gravity that it sits amongst that small handful where we look to history when deciding our actions, such as the slave trade or many of the genocides that we've seen in the 20th century. And although it differs from those genocides in terms of the intent involved, it's not a crime of specific intent, it's a crime of oblique intent. We're doing a course of action that we know will cause great death and suffering without necessarily wanting that to happen, but it's still knowing it will happen. It is, in consequences, the greatest crime in human history. Out of one thing, the most human beings will die from the climate crisis more than any other action in history. That puts it, I say, in a very unique and special category that we should have real adherence to. But some barristers believe that the principle of cab rank is so important that it justifies making large parts of the world uninhabitable and killing at least tens, probably hundreds of millions, possibly billions of people if we carry on the same course of action. There's this principle that's so important it justifies that. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, this principle does not justify that. Really, much of the disagreement between myself and Mr. Moran will relate to the idea of the principle of the cab rank. versus what actually happens in real life. And it is very interesting that as barristers, we are supposedly good at arguing about nuance and applying a rule to certain situations, but we seem fundamentally incapable of doing that in relation to the cab rent rule. And we have to have this one-size-fits-all rule of principle that doesn't actually really do much in practical terms for what we're seeking to achieve. And I would also say at the outset that I don't disagree with Mr. Moran's excellent defence of people in criminal trials. I think it's noble work, and I believe that everyone should be able to get criminal representation, and the cab rent rule should fully apply to all of those situations that he outlines. And I would also note that in criminal law, the existence of criminal legal aid, threadbare as it is, does actually go some way to allowing the cab rent rule to have a real practical impact. Most people can get representation for serious criminal offences. But what I don't agree with is that defending the principle of the cab rent in those criminal cases means that we have to defend it in cases involving fossil fuel companies. And I'm going to set out now why. It's interesting that Mr. Moran pointed to the issue of Thomas Paine and then said that if I, my learned friend, was in similar circumstances, he would want someone representing him. Well, actually, I can tell you that that situation has exactly happened. And I was brought into proceedings, injunction proceedings, which are quasi-criminal, by a local council for standing under a tree. And even I, as a barrister, with my income potential, had to give in to those proceedings and give the council exactly what they wanted, because I could neither afford the costs of getting representation, and nor could I afford the cost of losing if it went against me. And if we look at the modern Thomas Paine, which group is it that is constantly castigated by the media, is absolutely hauled over the coals, is that deeply unpopular group in our current society? I think Just Stop Oil would have quite a good claim to that title, wouldn't they? So how good is the cab rent rule at ensuring representation for Just Stop Oil? It doesn't work at all. There have been numerous injunctions taken out by fossil fuel companies who have gone to take the, I think as well, Mr. Moran mentioned that the cab rent rule helps to stop fossil fuel companies scooping up the best and the brightest legal talent. But that's exactly what happened in these injunction cases. The fossil fuel companies opened their checkbook and they figuratively wandered around these inns here and took the best barristers they could get, costing hundreds of thousands of pounds to get private injunctions, to get their own form of criminal law to stop protesters protesting on their forecourt. And in most of those cases, the protesters were unrepresented. So effectively, we had a situation where the law was being hugely skewed in favour of fossil fuel interests and against ordinary people, some of the most unpopular people whose spectra we're drawn to as a way for saying we should have representation for all. And they were effectively denied that representation by sheer cost. And I would say that the overwhelming reason that people cannot get representation in the current system is not that their cause is unpopular. It's that they don't have the money to afford representation, particularly at the civil commercial bar. Now, I actually asked the Bar Council to carry out research on this as part of my election to the Bar Council, and they refused because they don't want to open that particular Pandora's box, because they know that overwhelmingly, particularly the civil commercial bar, is almost entirely acting at the behest of the wealthy. And not even that. It's not even that, it's actually worse. Because of that lack of representation to people without money, the law is being massively skewed in favour of the wealthy. This is a zero-sum game. If fossil fuel companies are able to afford top-flight lawyers and other people are not, the law can, will, and is being skewed in their favour against other people. Where's the cab rank rule then? What representation for all principle is it protecting then? It is not in practice doing anything, or very little at all, in the civil commercial bar. Again, Mr. Moran pointed to the idea of you're ethically obliged to take the next customer in line, like a London cab rank. He then went on to make a massive straw man around lawyers working for free, which of course nobody's suggesting. But those of you may work out where I'm going with this, that there is something in between. Telephone book number fees, of the civil commercial bar, which I would estimate less than 20% of the population can afford, probably even less than that, and having to work for free. It is, of course, a state, if we think a service is so important that everyone should be able to access it, a state-regulated maximum fee is the obvious way to go. That's why when you get into a cab, it's a set amount per mile, which is set at an amount that most people can roughly afford, rather than them saying that'll be £2,000, mate. And you have to get into the next cab and try for less, and the next one to try again. It's completely pointless to have, say, we're having a service that everyone can come up and get it, when actually it is so expensive that people cannot do so. And the obvious solution to that would be to have a state-regulated maximum fare for barristers, and an obvious way to set that would be at the legal aid rate, which would show that barristers are getting paid, but that they're also actually acting for all. And the legal aid point also points to another interesting part, which is the fact that the cab rank rule is a one-size-fits-all policy. It is bizarre for a group of barristers or a profession of barristers who are supposedly good at arguing nuance to say that we must have one rule to apply in all these different situations. Why is it that the necessity for representation is the same for someone in a criminal trial where the state is bringing proceedings against you, which could result in loss of liberty? Why is the need of representation the same for that as the case of someone trying to open a new oil field? It's not, is it? It's just not. And we see that in the circumstances in which the state is willing to pay for people to get representation. Legal aid is a very good, the availability of legal aid is a very good way of determining in which cases representation is most important. So yes, the state provides legal aid for criminal trials, for criminal defence. And yes, the state provides some legal aid where people are going to lose their home or in some family proceedings, but they don't provide legal aid for commercial and civil cases. There's no prospect of them doing so. And I don't believe there's any sensible campaign for them to do so, because it would be ludicrous. And that's because we ultimately clearly recognise that your need to have representation in a criminal trial is just more important than your right to open a new oil field. And in that respect, we need to look in more detail when assessing these matters as to what role a barrister is actually playing, rather than saying that their requirement to represent is the same in all cases. And there is clearly a massive gulf between a criminal lawyer defending and someone opening a new oil field. And the opening the new oil field, that transactional work, is much closer to a solicitor's role, or indeed to management consultancy, or potentially accountancy, than it is to a criminal barrister acting in defence. And that is why the state does not provide legal aid, and there's no prospect of it. It's actually not that important. And in all other matters, we can put pressure on people to withdraw professional services from fossil fuel companies committing the greatest crime in human history. Why is it that we are not doing so in relation to barristers? I would argue that actually what it is quite simple. There is a significant subset of the civil commercial bar that has an incredibly lucrative relationship with the fossil fuel industry. They are making untold amounts of money from continuing the richest, wealthiest, and most powerful industry that has ever existed, and helping it to continue. And they do not want to give up that lucrative work because they're making lots of money from it. And in many ways, Mr. Moran should be appalled that those people who don't give a fig for representation for all, more than lining their own bank accounts, are stealing his amazing work, doing important representation people in the criminal courts, and then saying that that should be used to justify them doing unnecessary oil expansion that's going to lead to the deaths of millions of people. It's a disgraceful argument, and one that I'm surprised that Mr. Moran is letting people steal his thunder from. It's also worth noting, when we're talking about the cab rank rule, that it only applies to those who are legal persons. Now, interestingly, when the rule was made under Thomas Paine back in the late 18th century, there was no such thing as a company. They were made up in the mid-19th century. So cab rank rule could not have applied when it was first done to companies. it applied to human beings needing representation in the courts. And I wonder at what point human beings needing representation to stop their liberty being impinged upon were equated in exactly the same way to companies pursuing an economic interest. Why did that leap happen? When did that debate happen? Because the two things are not the same situations. And I don't think there's convincing arguments why they should be. Why should a fictional economic entity have the same right to representation as a human being in criminal proceedings? And we must look at who is not included in the cab rank rule, given it only applies to those currently recognised as legal personalities. Someone else around the world who is impacted, a child in another country who's impacted by the effects of the climate crisis, where's their right to the cab rank rule and representation in the English courts to challenge those who are directly causing their suffering? They don't have it. Where's the people of the future who are going to be directly impacted by this fossil fuel expansion, but where's their right to representation and a voice in the English courts? They don't have it. Where's the natural world? Why is it that a river can be destroyed and not be able to have representation before the courts, but a fictional economic entity doing that destruction, like an oil company or a water company, does get representation? Why is that the case? And looking to, again, to the purposive effect of the cab rank rule and what it's there for also shows the difference between defending the amazing defence work that Mr. Moran does and this issue over prosecuting climate protests. Because again, the two things are very different. When you're defending yourself, effectively you're being coerced. The state is bringing a proceeding against you and you must defend yourself or risk your liberty. But in prosecuting, the state is bringing it. They are voluntarily bringing that case and they have a huge discretion in bringing that case. And that prosecutorial discretion is vast and it is increasing and it is being used as a political tool by the government against those it disagrees with. And that is why the courts at the moment are chock full of old ladies who've been sitting on the road wearing an Insulate Britain or Just Stop Oil banner. But they're not chock full of water companies committing serious criminal offences every single day, polluting our rivers. That's why. Because the state is voluntarily choosing to prosecute those protesters. And that is becoming to such a level that we as barristers must take a view on it and say, thank you, and say that we are no longer going to play along with that. There is also, I would submit, a difference between representing someone in proceedings after a crime has been committed to determine whether they've committed that crime and facilitating them to continue committing that crime. And that is what we see here. If you note, the declaration very carefully doesn't state that we will not represent any fossil fuel executives. I would still defend, if I was a criminal barrister, I would still defend a fossil fuel executive in a criminal proceeding or at the almost inevitable international tribunal that those fossil fuel executives will face in the following decades for their crimes against humanity. They deserve representation there in the same way as the Nazis deserved representation at Nuremberg, or those committing the Rwandan genocide got representation when they were in front of the international tribunal. What they do not deserve is help and facilitation to continue committing those crimes, which is what opening new oil fields will do. The causation between the opening of those new oil fields and the death and destruction they will result in is established by science, and we should not be facilitating that to continue. Finally, I'd just like to note that it's interesting that some of the stuff which is put down as the cab rank rule is actually not. There are many things which our profession could do even short of disobeying the cab rank rule, which they refuse to do. And Nick Vinal was brought up at the head chair of the bar. And he isn't just defending the cab rank rule, he's defending the right of barristers to continue marketing to fossil fuel firms, putting themselves out there to fossil fuel firms. And as well, saying that sustainability in the profession somehow alleviates our moral obligation to not exacerbate the climate crisis. Just finally as well, one of the amusing things that doesn't breach the cab rank rule, as it turns out, is signing this declaration. I self-reported to the Bar Standards Board, and I got a letter back a few weeks ago saying that just the mere signing of this declaration does not in fact breach the cab rank rule. So I'd really urge all of you to sign the declaration, knowing that it wouldn't put you in breach of any professional obligation in any case. And also it points the way that actually these lawyers, these barristers could, if they want to, put out a declaration saying, actually, Yes, I will do fossil fuel work if I'm forced to, but I fundamentally disagree with you, what you are doing, and I wish to have no part in it. And I would rather if you didn't instruct me. Why do they not do that? Because the current system is making them a lot of money. And that is it. It's not some high-minded principle of representation for all. It's using that high-minded principle as a cheap way to cloak their desire to make a lot of money out of the greatest crime in human history. And that's why I urge you to vote against the motion. Thank you.
Now, 5 minutes from Mr. Moran in rebuttal.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to try and limit my comments to being from the rebuttal comments. It was, my friend opened with the argument that he doesn't believe the cab rank rule justifies destroying the environment. Neither do I. I put it plainly that my side of the argument is the cab rank rule is not destroying the environment. That is a false, completely false connection. Yes, there are barristers who represent commercial interests, but the idea that if the cab rank rule doesn't exist, that there would be any impact or difference to the environment, I would suggest is absolutely hyperbolic. There would be difficult other problems for the rest of the profession. I noticed that my learned friend didn't address the argument, which I think is central and key to this. How do we justify, if we remove the cab rank rule from environmental and civil law, what do, and the example I get from Leeds Crown Court, when I'm walking into Leeds Crown Court and somebody stops me and says, how can you represent that person in the dock? I say, it's my job to. Yes, but there's exceptions. You don't have to represent oil companies. Why is it okay to represent a rapist, but not an oil company? Wow. Paul Powlesland thinks that one's a much bigger issue than the other. You should have been at a debate and you would have seen why. Because he, rightly, is very angry and passionate about the environment. Some people are angry and passionate about the abuse of children. Some people are angry and passionate about all sorts of things. The problem is, once you take away a principle, you take away the principle. And there's no argument that he's managed to do that answers that. Also, when he says that the cab rank rule might be able to apply to crime, but not to civil because of issues to do with fossil fuel, well, what about medical negligence cases? What about somebody that's been injured? That's got nothing to do with criminal defence. What about employment law cases, when there might be a difficult employment law case with a very unpopular client then? What about actually when, for example, in a smaller city like Leeds compared to London, I'll say it's because it's my home city. What about when Just Stop Oil stop all the traffic going into Leeds city centre and they want representing? What happens when they're very unpopular and there can be something said against them? Because the problem is, when my learned friend says one size doesn't fit all, when it comes to principles, when it comes to a code of conduct, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. He suggests that there's no sensible debate or campaign for legal aid for civil cases. One, there should be. But also, that doesn't address all the other things that I've said. Crowdfunding for cases, all sorts of different issues and ways of getting funding. The fact that funding is not the way it should be isn't a reason to get rid of a rule that says people should be represented. And in regards to when he says fictional economic entities, why should they have rights? Well, I'm sorry, for the law students in the room, we know why that they have rights. It's because that's the only way to have responsibilities. You can only sue a company if it's got legal entity status. You can only prosecute a company if it's got legal entity status. You can only hold them accountable and responsible. And I'm sorry, there are plenty of cases over many decades now of companies being found to be responsible, companies being sued, companies in relation to health and safety problems that have had to change their ways because of the legal framework and because they have legal entity status. And I'll end on this. He suggests that prosecuting is very different from defending. Most climate change activists, if they were to get into some kind of trouble for the kinds of things that we've seen, blocking the roads and things like that, would likely end up in the magistrates' court rather than the Crown. Barristers who prosecute in the magistrates' court are the most junior. If they're pressured into turning back around, with the CPS, it's not only that they wouldn't get protesting work again, they'd never get any prosecution work. That's a future person prosecuting someone accused of a serious crime. And because they've turned around and decided to pick and choose their cases, they're not going to be able to carry on prosecuting. And should they sign a declaration to say that they would never prosecute climate change protesters, then they're going to find themselves under some difficulty, because as a number of the criminal practitioners will know, to be able to prosecute, you need to be on something called the Crown Prosecution Service panel. And if you were to turn around and say, I'm going to pick and choose what I can prosecute, they won't be on that panel for very long.
Thank you. Right, well, that was fascinating, I think we'll agree. And now I'm going to throw it open to anybody who's got any questions from the floor. Yes.
I have personally on your left.
Mr. Moran.
Chris, there we go. Yeah, go on.
About political structure and how we are supposed to be part of the political structure, because that suggests that somehow we sit outside of it, and how could you reconcile that kind of the reality that we live in?
Yeah, I can add to that. I do think the reality is that the vast majority of barristers do sit outside of a political structure. Very, very rarely. In fact, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to take a dispassionate view and represent either side in an argument. The problem with getting rid of the cab rank rule, that when political pressures are brought to bear, it can create an environment where things become more political than they otherwise would be. So I don't accept that the real reality here is that there is a political structure in regards to barristers. I don't accept that. I think that in the main, we sit outside it.
I think that's a very naive view of the role of barristers. Law is ultimately politics codified, and barristers can and are very political. What could be more political than the determination of the criminal penalty for certain forms of protest? Very political, isn't it? Now, if the oil companies wanted to change that, they could have gone to Parliament and got Parliament to pass a new law giving additional penalties for protesting on oil company forecourts. But they didn't. They went like an oligarch with their checkbook open into the Inns of Court and got lawyers who most people, 90%, 95% of the people in this country could not afford, and they spent hundreds of thousands of pounds buying their own law to make the penalty for protest on their forecourts more than for average people. That is a direct political act, and it is the use of the law and resources within additional resources that the oil companies have to skew politics and the law in their favour. It's blatant politics. What else is it?
I'm going to jump back in there. Politics do create our laws, but I don't get to pick which side of that law I'm arguing. So I am outside of the politics on that. It would be political if I was to say, well, I will only prosecute climate change protesters because I really don't like them, and I really like the law that's there to stop them. I can represent either side. So yes, laws are created politically, of course, but when I represent a particular side, I'm not bringing politics into my decision making. Somebody's rung up my clerks to ask if I can represent a side, and the answer is just yes.
Yes.
I'm Charles Ruston. I'm a criminal barrister for 25 years, call and have some knowledge of Chris Moran. So that's Sorry.
Careful, Chris.
More willing to make himself unpopular for somebody else's cause. Chris Moran, and I can't stand. I think your answer to the last question has really answered for me what was itching at my brain while you were talking. I think there's a conflation going on between our advisory function and our representative. I think to call us naive or to say we should live in the real world, it's really undermined by the fact that I put on an 18th century horsehair wig to go to work in because I disappear when I'm there. That's not me. That's not the person that goes to the polling station and votes. That's not the card-carrying member of the Labour Party. That's the barrister who brings through 600 years of tradition to say here and now there are limits past which government cannot cross. And I stand between the executive and the individual. I represent protesters. What you appear to be suggesting is that I should have the right not to represent protesters. And I don't think I do. Much of your argument seems to be not that there shouldn't be a cap rank principle, but that we should have a look at the cap rank principle and say over the last 20 years, much has been undermined and lost, either through the actions of politics or through the actions of money. And yes, I do think that expensive private silks should have to do legal aid work. Maybe as part of their qualification every year, I have done 24 hours at least of legal aid work. I don't know. His lordship is correct. There aren't enough of them going into the magistrates' court. The cap rank principle has been skewed. That's not to say it's bad. That's to say it needs fixed.
Okay.
Was there a question there?
Well, it's
The question is, have you conflated our roles as advisory and as representative?
I think those roles, as I said in my previous answer to the question, I think those roles are necessarily conflating themselves. I don't think it's as easy to say that we are just these representatives going up and defending the liberty of individual defendants. And I think a lot of this work being done for the fossil fuel industry by barristers is, as I said in my talk, much closer to that done by solicitors, accountants, management consultants, or other professionals who are also taking huge sums of blood money for representing the fossil fuel industry, rather than the kind of amazing defence work that criminal barristers do. I think it's actually highly unfortunate that these people who aren't really doing what I would see as traditional barrister work are gaining the protection from public opprobrium by trying to associate themselves with the incredible deeds that criminal defence barristers do.
yes.
I agree with a lot of what you said, but isn't really where the conflation comes in, that declaration, of which most of us agree so much, ends with including the prosecution, and the prosecution can only mean, as I take that, in the criminal courts. So I think if everything else had been about an attack on the advisory work or marketing or many of the other really good points that you raised, I think the criminal bar wouldn't be up in arms about this declaration. But it's the inclusion of that, I think, that brings out some of the strength of feeling.
Just to be clear, are you saying that effectively the first part of it, so we declare we will hold ourselves in supporting new fossil fuel projects, you don't have too much of a problem with, but it's the second one about prosecution.
I think that is where the criminal bar are engaged and where the criminal bar feel angry doing, as we do day in, day out, the hardest and the worst paid work, to be included in that declaration. I think that's where it grates. I don't know if others agree, but for me, that's the... I mean,
the first one definitely applies more to me because I'm not a criminal lawyer nor am I a prosecutor. So I actually...
And the fact that so many people have signed that, who could never prosecute cases.
However, there were criminal barristers who did sign it, who represent fossil fuel protests, so anti-fossil fuel protests in the courts day in, day out.
You're on the CPS panel.
No.
So they can't.
No, but it's about saying that they think the way those prosecutions are currently being done is unfair. Many of the protesters can't get representation and are representing themselves because of the current funding rules. and that the state is blatantly using its prosecutorial discretion in a way that's unfair, and the judges are starting to collude in that. For instance, we know about what Silas Reed is doing in a London Crown Court of not even letting climate protesters mention climate change in court and putting people in jail for saying the words climate change in court, which conflicts with ancient principles of the right to freedom, right to trial by jury.
Okay, do you have a question?
Yes. So,
Yes, yes.
I think it's quite interesting. Okay, this is almost a political point, but then this is kind of a political discussion. If we think of the high watermark for the cab rank rule being very simply the Nuremberg trials, the war crimes trials, where people like my grandfather were involved in representing war criminals, having committed crimes, to make sure that justice was seen to be done as all criminal lawyers would. If we look at how the bar treated the introduction of legal aid in 1947, and I know this can be highly contentious for many barristers, especially those with a right of centre view, should we say. If you look at the way that the bar went from being a very common law, almost all chambers were common law chambers in criminal and civil law alongside each other, silks, all sorts of people carried out all sorts of work virtually everywhere. So where we are now, 70 or 80 years later, the bar has chosen by its specialisation, by its diversification, by the fact that so many of those wealthy, right-leaning barristers no longer, for very good economic reasons, do any criminal work or any common law work at all. They only practice in very wealthy, selective civil law areas. So we can see where my known friend Paul Powlesland is coming from. And actually the bar has chosen that route to abandon using, and this is when civil aid was available across everybody over the last 40 or 50 years, not just the last 6 or 7 years. But the bar has chosen to abandon the cab rank rule by that 70% who've walked away from all common law practice and only do very wealthy, ludicrous law practice. That's the question.
Well, rather than respond, let's have another question. So you had a question.
Yes, I'll make
Or
a
point.
question. A question rather than a speech. I just wonder whether you think it is important. Powlesland?
You can call me Paul, it's fine.
Paul,
We're not in court.
to have, do you not think it's important to have people with moral integrity, ethical codes, perhaps sharing your political views in this, working on the prosecution side, to bring that independence of mind and judgment to the decisions about which cases go ahead or not, to be involved in that discussion about what's a fair prosecution?
Potentially, although I don't know the extent to which the Crown Prosecution Service actually can be swayed. And I would worry that a lot of the time this working within the system is just generally captured by the system, and doesn't actually have any great import on it at all, I would say. I also would like to respond to that previous question, which was, I think, raised an interesting point around Nuremberg. Actually, I generally try to keep away from Nuremberg because I think the Holocaust is a crime of such gravity, it's just not good to compare things. So I would like to talk instead about the Rwandan genocide, of saying the difference between, yes, those who conducted the Rwandan genocide should have had lawyers acting for them at the International Tribunal. The comparison here is different. The difference is, would you act in a shipping dispute at the time the genocide was happening to ship machetes into Rwanda? That's the difference. Would you act in a shipping dispute to get a ship unimpounded and the machetes brought into Rwanda, knowing what they were going to be used for, and you were the one that had to decide whether those machetes effectively make it there or not? That's the difference here. It's not about trying people for a crime after the fact. It's about doing an action, knowing that that action will result in great death and a deeply immoral outcome.
Right, we've got various other people who want to raise their hands raised. So let's take 2 or 3 and then further comments. So Gary, you want to say something?
So, Mr. Powlesland, the family law justice system is creaky. If a parent waives your declaration and assaults a barrister appearing for a child protection agency, or a paedophile hunter assaults a barrister appearing for a parent, would you agree that you and the other 109 English lawyers who signed the declaration should be in jeopardy of aiding and abetting those assaults?
I think that's nonsense, and I think our profession can actually act with regards to nuance, and can argue about things and tell the difference between things. And if you're unable to tell the difference between not acting in these circumstances for a fossil fuel company and then being responsible for a paedophile hitting someone, then maybe you don't possess the requisite argumentative abilities here.
Well, can I just, if I may, just rephrase the point? Is there a danger that this is going to lead to the polarization of the legal profession in a way which would reflect the polarization of so many things in our society?
I think that lawyers have the ability to be able to argue in different situations. Actually, it was something that Mr. Moran said in responding that I haven't had a chance to respond to, by saying that effectively by doing this, I'm opening the floodgates for people to say, well, maybe you shouldn't prosecute paedophiles, or maybe, as you say, I'm okay to hit a barrister who's representing someone who's accused of child sexual abuse. And surely the argument to that is we can make individual arguments and say why in a certain case, actually, it's important for people to have defense, a criminal defense barrister in this situation because the state is bringing those proceedings. But that is very different from opening a new fossil fuel oil field. Surely we can make those. We're intelligent enough to make that argument. And I think it's a sign of a form of weakness in our profession to say we need this one size fits all rule, because if we don't have it, then things that are totally different might get lumped in with it and we might have to make an argument. Surely making an argument is something we're supposed to be doing, right?
One thing I'd like to come in on, not necessarily that I'm aware that you didn't get a further chance to rebuttal, so I'm not going to address the points that you've made. But one of the things that you've said before was you're not sure how much influence prosecution barristers have on the CPS. We actually have quite a lot of influence. So if there's an issue or a problem with the gathering of evidence, or there's something that's been extremely unfair, there's been a number of cases where I ring the reviewing lawyer and the case does come to a stop. So we do have influence on our cases. But
Did the CPS say in the Judge Reed cases, actually, it's unfair for you to be saying that, mentioning climate change in this court will send people to jail? I don't think they did.
well, I don't know about that particular case. I wasn't involved in that case.
Question over there.
Yes, the first question, you used the example of if you had the power to stop the machetes being shipped over to Rwanda. Well, in that situation, viruses don't have the power. I assume the judges should have the power. So at what point do you realize that probably you're pointing the gun at the wrong person, and if you actually want to
Point the gun at the judge.
Yeah,
Is that your best point?
Affect change decision making. You could actually say probably the judges should sign it and not the barristers, because all barristers do is make arguments, and you can make the best argument and still lose a case based on the facts. So if there's actually this moral, you actually understand this moral holdings, you probably focus on the judges and probably the lawmakers, because you're probably more effective at that point. So I'm just asking, at what point do you realize that probably putting other people in harm's way? Because in this situation, I've been in court as much as most people here, but there have been situations where I have interned with the persecutors, and I felt good about myself, and then we actually had to intern with the defense in sexual cases, and you're feeling like this person is a terrible person, but at the end of the case, you come to understand why this kind of role is. And as someone who's an international student coming from a country where this kind of role isn't in place, I think it's a very interesting one, because at that point, you're not working based on your conscience, you're actually working based on a role that assures you that this person going to jail has gone through every process, everything has been in place for them, the due process has been followed, and they're not going to get off in like probably 5 years because, oh, a lawyer made a mistake or they didn't get adequate representation. So just the main question for you probably be, are you focusing on the wrong people and putting the wrong people at arm's length?
I would say there that it's not, in that example I gave, it wasn't that the dispute in the court was about, are these machetes going to be used to kill people? It was a pure shipping dispute, unrelated to how they were going to be used. Because of course, the people they were going to be used against weren't represented in the courts, in the same way as the people who are going to die from the climate crisis are not currently represented in our courts either. It's a pure shipping dispute, and the other side might not have been represented. Do you still have that? And I just don't agree this idea that lawyers just put the case and don't have any influence over developing it. A few years ago, I signed a lawyer's declaration of rebellion, which in many ways was the precursor to this. One of the things it said, we are deceiving ourselves that we must wait for others to make the law, which we will merely interpret. From the invention of the tort of negligence to the circumstances in which judicial review can challenge executive power, lawyers and judges have historically been innovative in interpreting, developing, and even creating whole new areas of law. We too must be audacious, progressive, and creative in using the law to tackle the biggest challenges facing our planet and all those who live on it. We must remember that everybody has a role to play, and that as lawyers, our role is especially vital. Is the bar currently playing that role, or are they just putting themselves at the behest of those, the wealthiest, most powerful industry that has ever existed, to continue that industry? So I think you made another question.
Yeah. So there was another question over there. Yeah, you.
There's a part in that statement that you just read out where you said that we have to use the law. Could you read that sentence again, please? It's towards the end where you
we too must be audacious, progressive, and creative in using the law to tackle the biggest challenges facing our planet and all those who live on it.
So you say that you want to use the law, but you're also suggesting that the legal system as it stands is not fit for purpose to address the scope of this environmental catastrophe that we're going to live through or not live through, as the case may be. So how can you hold those opinions at the same time?
Because something which is imperfect might be all we have, and that's the argument, isn't it? It's not good. The way the system is currently set up is not good, which is why I'm trying to change it. But it is all we have, and we have very limited time. And to me, it is a great tragedy that at what I believe is the greatest crisis in human history, some of the most intelligent, hardworking, incredible people, which is at the bar, are almost entirely at the behest of those fueling that crisis rather than trying to stop it, ultimately. And that is what my activism comes down to. And that's why I've tried to say to barristers, hey, maybe don't do this work for money, because you're not going to be able to spend it, and your kids aren't going to be able to spend it because of, if we carry on this route, society is going to collapse. It's a pleading with them to actually say to 1 Essex Court, to 4 Pump Court, to Nick Vinyl.
Okay, we better not.
No, I'm sorry. 1 Essex Court is making millions of pounds out of the climate crisis, and they are overwhelmingly acting for the fossil fuel industry. Okay. And I believe them doing that is immoral. And I will debate any one of them any day to come here and say that them doing that work is in any way morally justified, and they are proud to do that work. Come and debate it.
Isn't the argument, though, to say to those people that you should also be representing the other side, even if you have to do it pro bono, given the amount of money that you've made?
Yeah, but they're not.
No, but that's the argument, isn't it?
Isn't their argument really we should enforce the cab rank rule, not that we should get rid of it?
But no, enforcing the cab rank rule, they would say, well, I'm willing to represent anyone who can afford my massive brief fee. And I am trying to move chambers like that towards this. So for instance, I'm trying to put, and lawyers responsible, trying to put pressure on chambers to say, okay, if you really have to act for these people because the cab rank rule, maybe every single hour you do for the fossil fuel industry, donate that money to anti-fossil fuel causes, or do 1 hour of pro bono mirroring every hour you do for the fossil fuel industry. But that will take pressure, and every time we try and put pressure on those chambers, for instance, me standing outside with a placard saying, please don't fuel the climate crisis, perfectly peaceful, people absolutely hammer us saying, what about the cab rank rule? They're entitled to do this work.
Okay.
That's why I have to go against.
There's lots of people who've got more questions, so we've got the time. So why don't you go next? Around cost.
To representation and one side having better policy and things like that. I was just wondering whether the cab rank rule is actually a solution to that particular issue, or whether or not that's more of a wider systemic issue, and perhaps one of the courts could be involved in when it comes to management and looking at cost and use, just to kind of balance things out in a way that's outside of the country.
Okay, come back to that in a minute. Let's take another question. Yep.
Right. Thank you. So, and this is a question for the opposition. So taking an instrumentalist approach to the suggestion that the cab rank rule should be dispensed with, surely what's really needed is not just that the cab rank rule is dispensed with, but that, and I think you've intimated this in your comments this evening, that certain barristers should be prevented from, all barristers should be prevented from representing certain, for instance, blood-sucking fossil fuel companies, or doing prosecutions of climate
And
change.
I never said blood sucking, I said blood money. Blood money.
Let's have-
Which again, I'm happy to debate anyone as to whether taking money from Spelling Street in 2023 is blood money. I'm open to that debate to anyone who would like to have it.
Let's stick to the debate we're having, not another one. Yeah, go on.
Right.
Sorry.
And if we, sorry, yeah. So I think that's really where you need to go for this to have any effect, and therefore, in terms of solving the climate crisis, and therefore, is the debate that we're having today really not just about whether we should allow barristers to advertise their own political views, and perhaps even directly or indirectly shame their colleagues who either have different political views and therefore take on the cases that they wouldn't, or might still have the same political views, but nonetheless take on those cases because they feel it's not their role as a barrister, as we've heard in an earlier comment this evening, it's not their role to advertise those views in their job as a barrister, but rather to take an objective approach and to be a tool of the law, no matter what the law says.
Okay, so 2 points there, costs and then that point.
That point, I would say, what's interesting is that for some reason, the cab rank doesn't apply to pro bono. Mr. Moran mentioned this. If it's really important we don't bring our political views and everyone's entitled to representation, then me representing people pro bono for political causes I agree with should offend people. Why is it different if I'm taking money for it versus doing it for free? I regularly do cases for people for free that I would normally charge for because I agree with them politically. So they are getting representation in a way they wouldn't because I'm taking on their political cause. And yet for some reason, that's totally A-okay. We know loads of barristers, almost all barristers will do work for causes for free that they agree with. Why is that allowed? Surely we should say that pro bono must be subject to cab rank rule as well. Why is it? I don't understand that. So that to me deals with a lot of the political.
And then the next point?
The costs point. Sorry, I've forgotten what it is now. It's why to do the questions they arise.
Sorry.
I was asking about access to justice.
Yeah.
And some people being like sort of throw lots of money out there. And I was just wondering whether the cab rank rule is actually, or the disapplication of the cab rank rule is actually a solution to that particular issue.
Yeah.
Or whether or not there are other ways of dealing with that. And I think one of the ways I was thinking was about case management and the awarding of costs and things like that.
I mean, that would be great. I don't see any sign of it happening. And already loads of Insulate Britain people have been put off from protesting because they've had to pay huge amounts of costs to the legal costs of the fossil fuel companies bringing that injunction. That's happening last week. And for all of these great words about wouldn't it be lovely if costs weren't so ludicrous and if members of the civil bar actually maybe earned money that was in any way tethered to reality, it's not happening, is it? It's not happening.
But interesting idea though, isn't it? Legal services order.
Is it likely that the civil bar are going to take, say, the salary that's equivalent to the legal aid any time in the next 10 to 20 years, which is well, yeah, sorry, or civil legal aid, exactly. These barristers who are acting for the fossil fuel company earning probably 10 to 30 times what I do as a civil barrister, right? What are the chances they are going to put their fees down to a level that most ordinary people could afford and therefore could actually genuinely have equal representation for them to fight the climate crisis? It's almost non-existent because that is not going to happen in the timescale we need to fight the climate crisis, which is pretty much now.
Right. So we're coming to the end. 2 more questions, I think. You've asked one already, but I don't think you've asked one yet. No, right. And then you. Okay.
So I'm a West Ham supporter, and it's the best team in the world. But no matter how much I try to advocate for them, unfortunately, not everyone agrees with me. So if we were to get rid of the cab rank rule, what is to stop barristers who just don't believe that the climate emergency is an emergency, working for the other side and saying to protesters, actually, no, I'm not going to represent you because you can't pay my fee, but actually I'm not going to represent you because I just don't agree with you.
Well, firstly, the declaration that we've done doesn't abolish the cab rank rule. It's still there for almost all cases except 2 very limited situations that we set out there. So I disagree with the premise of the question. But in all honesty, I don't think it would actually make a blind bit of difference if the barristers who overwhelmingly currently act for the fossil fuel industry anyway, a few of them are like, politically, I want to act for the fossil fuel industry, because they almost overwhelmingly act for them anyway. And at least then, what they're doing would be subject to at least some form of pressure. So for instance, if there was a chamber that said, actually, we do want to do work that causes the deaths of millions of people in the global south because we like that, then at least that's honest. And students could then say, actually, I'm not going to go to the chambers that deliberately wants to cause the deaths of millions of people in the global south because they like it, right? That at least there'd be some honesty around it. And that is actually one of the key ways that this change is going to happen. Lawyers Are Responsible is already protesting outside law firms saying students don't come here because this firm does work that is morally repugnant, and that is going to start happening outside chambers too. And actually, in some ways, it would make it easier for me if one Essex court came out and said, actually, we're not doing this because we want to earn loads of money. We're doing this because we actually really like causing the deaths of tens of millions of people in the global south. At least it would make it easier to argue against in this kind of charade we have at the moment where they pretend to be interested in representation for all through the cab rent rule, whereas in actuality, all they want to do is make lots and lots of money.
I should point out there's nobody here from one Essex Court or any other chambers to respond to that. And yes, you had a question.
Question for Mr. Moran. The government is criminalising increasingly trivial actions by way of protest, and I don't imagine they've finished yet. Do you feel there's any point at which you might think the legislation is so unfair, I would find it difficult to prosecute somebody in breach?
Yes. Technically speaking, there would be a point. It would have to be a effect. So, for example, everyone picks this example, the Nazi Germany example. I would have been able to prosecute on behalf of the state for, the kinds of crimes that they were putting out there against minorities. In that scenario, I'd stop being a barrister. If I couldn't represent because it got to a certain point that I couldn't represent them properly, because my job is to represent either side without fear or favour. If our politics got to that stage, I'd stop being a barrister and try to do something about the law.
What about if the death penalty was introduced?
Exactly, the death penalty. I would definitely stop doing criminal law if the death penalty.
Okay, I did say that was the end. There's one more question.
I was going to say that don't you think those are really extreme examples? Is there no sort of sliding scale? And it's like not representing a rapist isn't going to stop rape, but maybe not prosecuting climate protesters might be the start of a snowball effect where we stop having those laws being implemented.
I mean, I agree it's a sliding scale, but what I'm suggesting is that I have to represent either side without fear or favour. And in that sliding scale, if we get to a stage that we can't, then I'll stop being a barrister.
Okay, well, we'll probably go on all evening. And it's been extremely interesting. I think I'm now going to ask you to raise your hand. So I shall read it out again. Think carefully. The cab rank rule should remain and be adhered to, even in the context of climate change and the lawyers are responsible declaration of conscience. Who is in favour of that motion with Mr. Moran? Hands up clearly so we get the full score.
16.
I make it 35.
Okay, and who is against? Hands up clearly so we get this.
Some people voted.
Okay, so we had to abstain as first time. So it was 30.
That's interesting.
35, 18.
Both sides increased their tally.
Yes. However, in the first past the post system.
I'll take that. I'll go with that.
Now, I'd just like to say thank you very much for all coming, but I particularly like to thank Paul and Christopher for their contributions. It's been a fascinating debate. I didn't know whether anybody was going to ask questions. You've all so many questions that we could have gone on. So you clearly interested the room. You've both done a fantastic job. I just like to say that whatever you may feel about the cab rank principle, the fact that we have two rising stars at the bar who are obviously as talented as these two shows that the bar, whatever its futures may be, in some respects, the bar is in safe hands. So thank you both very much for your contribution. And should we show our appreciation?